Skaven. Um, I was reading through the army book, and there's really not actually a whole lot of lore in the Skaven 6th edition. I suspect that has to do with the fact that Skaven don't have a written history and are sort of an unknown quantity to the Empire and the High Elves. So, what we're going to do today is we're going to be reading another one of those sort of dramatizations, the stories that are in the back of the 6th edition books, like the one from the Bretonia. Yeah. At the head of his storm vermin bodyguard, Grey Seer Arqueek proudly contemplated the vast army he had at his command. It seemed that even the gigantic cavern in which the battle was about to take place could hardly contain all the Skaven assembled there. Advancing as a living tide of mangy fur, the Skaven horde was rapidly closing the distance separating it from the disciplined ranks of the enemy, the hated dwarf-things. At the front of the Skaven line, the Grey Seer noticed crazed plague monks of Clan Pestilence breaking into a run. Foaming at the mouth, the deranged heralds of Pestilence charged towards the enemy too soon, showing no respect for the clever battle plan that the Grey Seer had devised. Fools, thought Arqueek. As the monks charged in, the dwarves opened fire. A volley of crossbow bolts and handgun bullets tore through the first ranks of the plague monks, cutting down many of the fanatics. They seemed oblivious to the casualties and trampled over the wounded in their mad lust to reach the enemy. A sinister hiss rose from the dwarf line as two of their war engines fired simultaneously. Two huge gouts of fire were projected through the air in a slow-moving arc, landing in the middle of the monks. The flames enveloped the devotees of Clan Pestilence with horrific results. Most of them died screaming in the blaze, but some of them kept charging, their robes and fur ablaze. They finally reached the dwarf line, where they managed to drag down several astonished dwarves before the rest of the bearded warriors could cut them down. The Grey Seer was impressed by the ferocity displayed by the monks and made a mental note never to displease their clan if possible. Their savage charge had helped his plan after all. Attracting most of the dwarves' firepower, they had allowed the rest of the horde to reach the dwarves relatively unharmed. Large units of lightly armed Skaven were now charging the dwarf warriors, clashing in bitter melee. The heavily armored dwarves formed a solid shield wall, their axes and hammers exacting a heavy toll on the rat men. Here and there, though, a dwarf was overwhelmed by the sheer number of his opponents and was dragged down and torn to pieces. Where this happened, another dwarf warrior resolutely stepped in to close the gap in the shield wall, and the line held. After the initial ferocious assault, oh my goodness, I am so sorry about that. After the initial ferocious assault, the Skaven quickly lost courage, broke, and fled in disorder, too fast for the dwarves to follow. The Grey Seer observed the fleeing Skaven, and a smile formed on his lips. This first wave of attackers had been made up, for the most part, of enslaved clan rats, and it served its purpose of testing the dwarf defense. Even better, lying among the piles of dead slaves, he could see a decent number of dwarf-things. The casualties were in the order of 10 to 1 in favor of the dwarves. Good, the fight was going unexpectedly well, thought Arqueek. The main regiments of the Skaven army were waiting just behind the large masses of fleeing slaves and, at the Grey Seer's signal, started to move forward. The second wave was made up of many units of clan rat warriors and several large packs of giant rats goaded into battle by clan Molder packmasters. These were not the only beasts of Molders present on the battlefield. Just in front of Arqueek's storm vermin, a line of massive rat ogres was unleashed against the dwarves. Surprised by the silence of the dwarves' war machines, the seer extended his magical perception to examine the enemy artillery. His spirit pulled free from his body and rose above the fighting, crossing the entire battlefield in a flash to finally focus on the enemy's gun emplacements. He soon realized that the diversion created by the slaves had served a double purpose, allowing Clan Eshin's adepts to sneak their way to the back of the dwarf line and attack the cannons. The dwarves manning the guns put up a brave fight, but were soon dispatched by the poisoned blades of the gutter runners. Good, thought the Grey Seer. Now the lethal adepts of Clan Eshin would attack the dwarf line from the back and rout their missile troops completely. In his mind's eye, Arkweek saw the gutter runners hurl a flurry of poisoned throwing stars into a regiment of dwarf thunderers, but then, when the surviving dwarves turned around to return fire, the black-clad Eshin warriors turned tail and disappeared. The cowards, thought the Grey Seer, outraged. Or maybe they were just being too literal about their orders, he wondered. Perhaps with the elimination of the dwarf artillery, the gutter runners decided that they had earned their fee and left before having to suffer too many casualties. Arkweek would have a word with their leader after the battle. Grey Seer Arkweek turned his attention back to the action in front of him, where the rat ogres had almost made contact with the dwarf line. This time the fight was very different. On the left and right flank, the clan rats and giant rats were holding their own against the dwarves. Their efforts in breaching the enemy's shield wall were helped by small units of Clan Scryer, Globadiers. There are some really, really weird names in this Skaven. These specialist troops wore strange protective masks and were armed with glass globes filled with deadly poison gas. Their weapons killed many bearded ones, together with quite a few Skaven, when one of the globes missed its target or landed in the thick of the fight. That didn't matter, thought Arkweek. The dwarves were like a small island in a vast sea of brown fur. The Skaven seer had to admit that the dwarf-things were fighting well, and he could see that the battle still hung in the balance. Then the charge of the rat ogres hit home. The great beasts tore their way through the dwarf line with pleasing ease. The dwarf warriors were lifted in the air and quartered by the slashing claws of Clan Moulder's feral monsters. If a dwarf axe managed to penetrate the tough hide of one of the rat ogres, the wounded beast would just fight more ferociously, continuing the slaughter with renewed fury. The packmasters simply walked behind their creatures, stopping only to slit the throat of the few dwarves that had only been wounded by the rat ogres. Under such an onslaught, the dwarf morale finally gave way, and they ran, pursued by the ravenous monsters. The storm vermin rushed forward to take advantage of the gap opened by the rat ogres in the enemy line. Following in the wake of Clan Moulder's powerful war beasts, the Grey Seer and his bodyguards had to step over the broken bodies of many Skaven and dwarf-things. Arkweek was convinced that the battle was won. Soon he would be feasting on the dwarf lord's entrails. Right in front of the battle ogres, oh my goodness, right in front of the rat ogres, a mighty battle cry rang out. A new regiment of dwarfs had entered the fray, charging forward from the back of the dwarf line. The seer was sure that he had seen no troops held in reserve. This new unit had probably just arrived on the side of the battle. These dwarves were different from all the others. They wore no armor, were covered in tattoos, and all their fur had been dyed bright orange or red. Slayers! Arkweek was very close to squirting the musk of fear. As he remembered the accounts the Grey Seer Thankwall had given to the council of the battle prowess of these mad, death-seeking dwarves. He immediately ordered the storm vermin to halt. Hurling themselves towards the rat ogres, the slayers caught the large creatures unprepared. It was unusual for them to be attacked with such reckless ferocity. The dim-witted beasts were used to inspiring fear in their enemies, but these ones were different, and the monsters were puzzled, almost afraid. The Grey Seer couldn't believe his own eyes as the rat ogres were cut down one by one. Arkweek was particularly concerned about a huge slayer wielding a massive hammer encrusted in glowing runes. Every irresistible strike of the weapon pulverized the skull of another rat ogre. A few badly wounded rat ogres fought back viciously, eviscerating many of the slayers before finally succumbing to the dwarves' axes. The others turned to flee, trampling the Moulder packmasters who vainly tried to keep them in the fight with their whips. The dwarfs started to pursue the mutated monsters, but, catching sight of the Skaven's general's storm vermin bodyguard, changed direction and ran towards the elite enemy, bellowing guttural challenges. The The seer was about to order a prudent tactical retreat when he remembered the scryer rattling gun he had hired to support his storm vermin. If the new machine was half as good as the warlock engineers promised. "Fire! Fire!" ordered Arqueek, pointing at the slayers. The scryer weapon team aimed their multi-barreled gun at the dwarves and activated the warpstone gas pump that powered the weird machine. The weapon's first burst cut a red swath through the dwarves, slowing their advance. The scryer engineers started to cackle maniacally, turning wildly on the crank that raised the rate of fire of the machine to augment the already impressive rain of death. More and more slayers were sent to meet their maker. Grey Seer Arqueek was impressed. The weapon was certainly worth the astronomical price he had paid for it. Then suddenly, something went wrong. With a high-pitched whistle, a leak appeared in the canisters fueling the gun's pump, and a huge green, scalding cloud surrounded the weapon team. Screams of pain reached Arqueek, and he saw that the weapon was still firing, but the crew had lost all control over the direction they were firing in. The weapon's bursts drew a semicircular arc on the ground around the rattling gun and reached the terrified storm vermin. Many of the elite warriors were gunned down before the machine finally exploded, vaporizing the crew. Those treacherous fools had obviously sold him a flawed machine. The sorcerer was covered in the blood of his bodyguards. Someone was going to pay for that. The Grey Seer had to abandon his plans of revenge when he realized that he had far more pressing problems to hand. The few slayers left, led by the terrifying one with the runic hammer, were almost upon him. Arqueek raised a paw and pointed it toward the slayers, chanting words of power as he evoked a powerful spell against the dwarves. A green glow pulsated around his claws and then fizzled into nothingness. To his surprise, the Skaven felt that an external force was fighting his magic, coming from somewhere in the dwarf line. That couldn't be. He was a powerful Grey Seer. Surely he couldn't be defeated by one of those old dwarves and their trivial rune magic. Arqueek quickly scoffed a piece of warpstone, and soon felt the power surging through his entire being. It was an exhilarating sensation, and the Grey Seer savored it deeply before unleashing his new power against the dwarves. This time, there was nothing the runesmith could do to stop the green lightning erupting from Arqueek's outstretched paw. The slayers, now a few meters away, were hit by the warp lightning and died where they stood, consumed by the evil energy that arced from one dwarf to the other, melting their flesh and charring their bones. A satisfied growl emerged from the seer's throat as his enemies burned. Soon, all that was left of the slayers were a few smoking husks. That's how it should be. All his enemies were going to suffer the same fate. First these pathetic dwarf-things, and later the fools that sold him the malfunctioning rattling gun, and those cowardly gutter runners. Much to Arqueek's dismay, the hammer-wielding slayer picked himself up off the ground, his body covered in horrible blisters, his hair completely burned away. Before the surprised Grey Seer realized what was going on, the slayer was upon them. The dwarf, his face mad with fury, headed resolutely towards the hated Skaven, felling a storm vermin at every step. "Kill! Kill!" shouted Arqueek, desperately to his bodyguards, trying frantically to push behind the ranks of armored Skaven warriors. Then he stumbled on a corpse and fell to the ground. A few storm vermin stepped forward to protect him, but the slayer's hammer quickly dispatched them. The crazed dwarf reached the Grey Seer and raised his almighty weapon for the killing blow. Paralyzed by terror, all that the Skaven could do was stare at the rune-encrusted hammer about to descend on him. Suddenly, a shadow passed over the Skaven wizard. A cloaked figure had emerged out of nowhere and leapt to interpose itself between the dwarf and the Grey Seer. The mysterious figure was wielding a pair of wicked daggers that he plunged, blades crossed, into the base of the slayer's neck. The dwarf looked puzzled, as if he could not understand what had just happened. Then, with a vicious scissoring action, the black-robed Skaven pulled the blades outwards, and the head of the slayer fell to the floor with a sinister thud. Turning towards the Grey Seer, the Eshin assassin smiled enigmatically, revealing a set of vicious fangs. He spoke in a grim, hissing voice. "Grey Seers, my masters, trust your plan. They don't want you dead today. Get up and finish the dwarf-things. Do not let us down, Grey Seer." With that, the assassin darted back through the ranks of surprised storm vermin and disappeared in the confusion of battle. Leaving behind a very perplexed Grey Seer Arqueek, his heart just starting to slow down. After many hours of bitter fighting, the weary seer was at last witnessing his great plan coming to fruition. The huge numbers of the Skaven had prevailed and eventually overwhelmed the dwarf forces. Sorry, I really hope you can't hear those kids screaming in the background. Their shield wall broken, one after the other, the stubborn dwarf regiments had been surrounded and massacred by the rat men. Only one unit of the dwarf-things still remained. Heavily armored warriors with high-crested helmets and huge war banners were putting up a stalwart last stand, with their backs to the gigantic door that were the entrance to their ancestral home. In their midst, Arqueek easily recognized the leader of the enemy, a grim dwarf whose armor and axe were so encrusted with runes that the Skaven's eyes ached just to look upon him. Several times the savage charge of the clan rats had broken against these elite warriors, and now the situation had come to a standstill. The dwarves were surrounded and outnumbered 100 to 1, but the clan rats were hesitating. They didn't dare get too close to those lethal warhammers. Arqueek was furious. Surely he had been given command of the most cowardly troops in the Under-Empire. He had run out of warpstone, and his magic would now struggle to affect the dwarf masses around their protective runic banner. He decided instead to vent his frustration by blasting a few Skaven to smithereens as an example of what happened to those who disobeyed his orders, and to inspire a bit of courage in his underlings. As the Skaven sorcerer scanned his troops for suitable victims, his eyes fell on the last surviving regiment of slaves. He noticed that they were unusually cheerful and suddenly remembered the promise he had made to the slaves in his inspiring speech before the battle. Fight the dwarf-things, freedom to all who survive. Those slaves had fought well indeed, and he was now annoyed by the fact that he should now free them. A feral gleam touched his eyes as a solution formed in Arqueek's mind. The Grey Seer was pleased that, as usual, his mighty intellect had conceived the perfect way to get rid of both these last enemies and the overconfident slaves. The Seer of the Horned Rat raised his claws high above his head and started chanting a prayer to his foul god. A dark, billowing cloud rose from the ground and covered the entire unit of slaves. As the Skaven inhaled the vapors, their cheers for hope, for the freedom promised to them, were transformed into snarls of barely contained bloodlust. Some of the slaves started hacking at each other to satisfy the desperate need to kill that had gotten hold of their minds. Rising to his full stature, the Grey Seer pointed towards the last dwarf defenders, ordering in a booming voice, "Them! Get them!" With a ferocious roar, the slaves charged the dwarves, their small red eyes filled with fury. The leader of the storm vermin turned towards his superior to express his doubts. "Oh, most honorable eminency, many clan rats die. What can slaves do?" With a wicked smile on lips, Arqueek answered in a whisper, "What can slaves do? They keep dwarf-things busy. For just enough time. All warp fire throwers fire. Quick, quick." A respectful expression appeared on the storm vermin's face as understanding struck him. The armored rat man bowed low and answered, Yes, O most clever of generals." And that is the end of that little story there. I've never played Skaven as or against, but I've watched enough battle reports to know that that sounds pretty representative of how they play. They're like orcs, but less fighty, which is kind of fun, but I don't know, I'm an orc guy. I like greenskins, I like how fighty they are. So the Skaven just kind of seemed like a lame, they're pretenders, you know? Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this video.